Good evening, everyone. Okay, I know it's the end of a long day. I know studies have been hard. I know I'm being moved forcibly by somebody here.
Keep him on camera.
No, I didn't want to be in the camera. It's the end of a long day. You're tired. You've been studying because, science, But anyway, thank you all for being here for the 11th annual Dr. Philip Pumerantz Distinguished Lectureship. I want to lead off the festivities tonight by breaking the most important news. In the bottom of the fourth, it's Dodgers 1, Nationals nothing. So there you go. Before we get underway with some of the introductions of our folks here, I'd first like to mention that if you look in your program at the bottom of the inside page, you'll notice that this lectureship is made possible by a generous donation from the Sarkaria family. I'm very pleased to say that tonight we have with us Dr. Elaine Sarkaria. Also with us tonight from the Western U Board of Trustees is our chairman, Dr. Richard Bond. Our vice chairman is Linda Kranz. Our secretary, Mr. John Forbing. And trustee, Dr. David Sadova. Our deans with us tonight include the Dean of the College of Osteopathic Medicine of the Pacific, Dr. Paula Crone. The Interim Dean of the College of Health Sciences, Dr. D. Schilling. Dean of the College of Pharmacy, Dr. Daniel Robinson. Founding Dean of the College of Optometry, Dr. Elizabeth Hoppy. Dean of the College of Dental Medicine, Dr. Stephen Friedrichsen. In the crowd, the Dr. Stephen Friedrichsen Fan Club. And also with us, the Dean of the College of Podiatric Medicine, Dr. Kathleen Satterfield. From our university administration tonight, we have Dr. Diane Abraham, our Senior Vice President for Advancement. Dr. Devendra Agrawal, our Senior Vice President for Research. Dr. Clive Houston Brown, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. Our Chief of Mission Integration, Dr. Stephanie Bolin. And Dr. David Barron, our Senior Vice President and Provost. We also have a very special guest with us tonight. I'd like to introduce you to, if you haven't met him before, Dr. Norman Vinn, formerly president of the American Osteopathic Association. And now, without further ado, the First Lady of Western U, Sandra Wilson. Okay, you know him, you love him, you put the State of the University video on your phone. I'm pleased to introduce the President of Western U, Dr. Daniel R. Wilson.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I think I thank you. I'm not. Thank you all for being here this evening. This is really a wonderful remembrance of Dr. Pumerantz, and I thank the Sarkaria family for providing this venue for us tonight. With a truly world-class, groundbreaking scientist. I'm not on the Nobel Prize awarding committee, but if I were, I would put a vote in for Lee Hood. He's served at Caltech on the faculty and the University of Washington. He's developed groundbreaking scientific instruments that have made possible huge advances in biological and medical sciences, such as the first gas phase protein sequencer in 1982, which helped determine amino acid sequences in a protein, a DNA synthesizer in 1983, which presaged the era of genomic medicine to synthesize short sections of DNA. He developed the first automated DNA sequencer in 1986, which propelled the Human Genome Project, of which he was a major proponent in getting it put forward by the US government. More recently, inkjet oligonucleotide technology for synthesizing DNA, nanostring technology for analyzing single molecules of DNA and RNA. Dr. Hood also established the first cross-disciplinary biology department in the country, if not the world, the Department of Molecular Biotechnology at Washington in 1992, and co-founded the Institute for Systems Biology in 2000, and is credited with introducing the term itself, systems biology. He is an advocate, which we'll hear more about tonight, of P4 medicine. That is medicine that is predictive, personalized, preventative, and participatory. Scientific American counts him as among the 10 most influential people in the field of biotechnology in the world, and he's here with us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Hood.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight. What I'd like to do, excuse me, give you a personal story of how I've come to view 21st century medicine. And I'm going to suggest strongly that most of you change a lot of your lifestyle in the future. If in fact you want to live out what is certainly coming to be the life expectancy for young people, namely to be 100 years old and to still be physically active and mentally alert. So when I went to Caltech in 1970 as a young assistant professor, I was very interested in human biology, but I was very much daunted by the complexity of human biology. And it's very much like the fable of the elephant and the six blind men, each feeling a different part of the elephant and declaring it's a stump, a fan, a spear, and so forth, when in fact, summing all six observations together just barely begins to touch the complexity of what an elephant is. And at that time, we had no language for talking about biological complexity. That came to be systems biology. We had no systems-driven technologies, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And most important of all, we hadn't even thought about a technique called deep phenotyping, which I'm going to explain, but it lets you make billions of measurements on individual humans, and these give us the ability to translate your present health status beautifully. I remember reading in 1973 The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn about paradigm changes in physics, and he made two major points. One is paradigm changes are difficult to come by because you have to think outside of the box to arrive at them. And I will say, when we educate students today, we don't do a good job of teaching them how to think outside the box. And there are great ways for doing that today. The second point he made is even if you succeed in proving a paradigm change, you may have a lot of trouble getting it accepted because scientists and people in general are intrinsically quite conservative and reluctant to give up long-held beliefs. So I started out my career at Caltech thinking about how we could approach this problem of making a lot of measurements on human beings, and it turned out to be the first of 7 paradigm changes I participated in. And these 7 paradigm changes all dealt with biological complexity, but what they did beautifully was frame how I think about 21st century medicine. So I'll give them to you very briefly, and you've heard the first one. That was, in a sense, bringing engineering to biology. And we developed, over the years, 4 instruments at Caltech and 2 other instruments elsewhere that set the foundation for modern molecular biology. And of course, the automated sequencer made the Human Genome Project possible. But to put it in perspective, I remember sitting in my office in 1973 when the chairman of biology walked into me and said, I want to urge you in the strongest possible terms to give up this technology development you're working on. And I said, nope, I'm not going to do it. It's working well, and I'm happy with it. And 25 years later, he said he did that because the senior people in biology at Caltech all felt it was unseemly to have an engineer in biology. And they wanted me moved to engineering. And he said, at least I didn't ask you to do that. Anyway, these instruments then led to the second paradigm change with the automated DNA sequencer. And that, of course, was the Human Genome Project. 12 of us went to Santa Cruz in the spring of 1985, and we were to debate about whether this was a good or a bad idea. And we unanimously agreed on 2 things. One, it could be done, but technically at that time was quite challenging. And number 2, we were split 6-6 on whether it was a good idea, and those against it were really fanatically against it. And they were terrified that big science would swallow up the more traditional small science. And of course, big science enriched small science absolutely incredibly. But when I went out into the community, I'd say initially 80% of the biologists were utterly opposed to the Genome Project. And the institute that most firmly opposed it was the National Institutes of Health. And they bitterly opposed it right up until the transition period in '89, when a committee of the National Academy of Sciences declared we should do the Genome Project. And NIH switched over and played a major role in the Genome Project after that. Now, the automated DNA sequencer was interesting in yet another way. That is, to do it, I had to bring together chemistry, engineering, computer science, and molecular biology, and get people to talk to one another and figure out how to do it. And once we brought those 4 people together, it took us about 3 weeks to figure out the whole strategy, and took about 4 years to figure out how to do it. But what it made me realize was that biology, leading edge biology, ought to be done in the context of a cross-disciplinary environment where leading edge biology can say to the technologist, we need this measurement. And the technologist, once they devise the instrument, could say, we need these computational tools. So I proposed this to the president of Caltech. He loved the idea. The chemists liked it, the engineers liked it, the biologists vetoed it. And I'll leave it to you to figure out why they might veto it. So Bill Gates actually made it possible for me to go to the University of Washington Medical School and start the first department of molecular biotechnology there. And this department was spectacularly successful. We developed the first 2 major algorithms for the Human Genome Project, how you assemble DNA and validate its quality. Phil Green did that. We had 2 people who pioneered the first 2 major techniques for the newly emerging field of proteomics, Rudy Ebersol and John Yates. We developed the inkjet technology that Agilent uses today for synthesizing enormous numbers of fragments of DNA, and on and on. But what I'd really wanted to do was build on top of that cross-disciplinary environment this thing we call systems biology, which we'll speak about in just a moment. But what was really interesting is the bureaucracy at the University of Washington absolutely inhibited that. And if you think about it, bureaucracies are always honed by the past, and almost always they just barely can deal with the present. They have a hell of a time dealing with the future. So I decided I would resign from the University of Washington in 2000 and start the first Institute for Systems Biology. It was a nonprofit independent research institute. And of course, systems biology is this fascinating idea that when you look at biological complexity and study it, you can't do it one gene or one protein at a time. You have to think about it in terms of the systems that operate in the biological organism and how you can assess whole systems and not just whole genes and so forth. And we pioneered techniques in how to do systems approaches to biology and how to do systems approaches to disease. But one of the most important things we did in the very early 2000s was essentially began focusing on a systems approach to disease, and that led to the formulation of two really important framing concepts for 21st century medicine. One is the idea a systems approach to disease, we called systems medicine, is the fundamental tool for dealing with the complexity of pathology. And the second idea that emerged somewhat more inchoately was this idea that healthcare should be predictive, personalized, preventive, and participatory. We called it the 4 Ps. And in thinking more deeply about the 4 Ps, it was obvious that the medical system was utterly missing one of the two major domains of healthcare at that point in time. The two domains are wellness and disease. Wellness was absolutely ignored at that period of time. So in 2014, Nathan Price, a colleague of mine at ISB, and I decided we would do a pilot project on what we came to call scientific wellness. And we used this idea of deep phenotyping with billions of measurements. And we were able to demonstrate the power of scientific wellness. And I'll go into that in a great deal more detail in just a few moments. It was a 9-month project, and at the end of it, the 108 friends that we'd persuaded to go through this deep phenotyping, about 95% of them wanted to go on and do more. So we started a company called Aravale that brought scientific wellness to consumers. And again, I'll talk about that in just a few moments. Now, scientific wellness was a really controversial new idea because wellness, in fact, we had an enormous debate whether we should ever use the word wellness because it has such a pejorative response based on hucksters and shysters, but I insisted wellness really described what we wanted to do. And so it did capture the attention of the CEO of Providence St. Joseph's, which is the third largest nonprofit healthcare center in the US. And in April of 2016, he came to me and said, look, I'd like you to consider becoming the chief science officer for Providence, and I'd like you to consider affiliating the Institute for Systems Biology with us to help us with our research. And we, in fact, decided to do that because this was exactly the approach we needed for bringing these conceptual formulations of 21st century medicine to healthcare. So as I look back at these 7 paradigm changes, I can say I learned a number of things about them. One, paradigm changes really can change in fundamental ways how you think about science or how you carry out science. Number two, for every one of the paradigm changes that we did, we were severely criticized, some more severely than for others. But every one of them, we had to deal with that kind of criticism. And of course, the most interesting of the things I learned is really new ideas almost never can emerge from old organizations for exactly the reasons I gave before. They are contained and constrained by bureaucracies of the past, and they can't deal with the future. So every one of these 7 ideas had new structures that enabled them to be created. I think another thing that's really important for the young students is if you're really convinced you're right about something and you've got a lot of skeptics out there, determined optimism is utterly essential. You have to just keep going and you ignore the chatter. And if you're successful, you win, and if you're not, you have to eat some humility and go back and start all over again. How do we know when a paradigm change gets achieved? It's when it lets you do something you need to do that you could never do before. And so those are the lessons I learned. Now, with this background, we can talk about what 21st century medicine is. And I'll say, in the last 100 plus years, there have been 2 big paradigm changes in medicine. The first was initiated in 1910 with the Flexner report. Flexner went and reviewed 155 trade schools that existed then, and almost to a school, they were abysmal. They did not use science. They didn't train physicians very well. So Flexner wrote a scathing report and said, 1, get rid of most of those schools. And they did. But he said, 2, use science to treat patients and use science to train physicians. And Hopkins and a few other schools leapt on this idea, and together with, as you can see there on the left, the sciences of the 20th century, they created a medicine that focused on identifying and fixing disease. And of course, as you've heard, 21st century medicine is using these more global approaches toward the complexity of disease, scientific medicine, P4 medicine, scientific wellness, and so forth. And it's all about the 4 Ps on the one hand, but it's really about understanding wellness, understanding disease, and understanding the transitions between the two so you can reverse them immediately. And we'll talk in detail about that. So I will say 98% of the healthcare institutions in the US and the world today practice 20th century medicine, even if they have the word precision in front of them. Okay, the Institute for Systems Biology turned out to be really a wonderfully fun organization to kind of at least grow older in. And it wasn't only about science, that is, about biology and disease and technology and computation. It was about taking a systems approach to how you approached big, hard problems in science. The fact that you needed strategic partnerships. The fact that often you had to spin off companies so you could get venture capitalists to give you a lot of money to do important things you'd never get from NIH. So you had to be able to use all these things and mix them together. ISB, in its now 19 years of existence, has spun off 8 companies, and all of them have been successful in varying degrees. What systems biology gave systems medicine were 2 really important intellectual concepts that are the heart of what systems medicine is about. One we've talked about, it's dense phenotyping. It's taking the individual and making as many of these different kinds of measurements as you possibly can afford, and that's the unfortunate limiting factor. But we'll talk about dense phenotyping in considerable detail. But it's really the key to understanding both wellness and understanding disease and their transitions. The second is the realization that complex biological systems operate by virtue of biological networks that are interactions of proteins and other informational molecules that are the mediators of development, of physiologic responses, and of aging. And if they become disease perturbed, they cause disease. So if you can see how a disease-perturbed network differs from its normal counterpart, you get deep and fundamental insights into how to create biomarkers that can detect the disease and or drug targets that might be able to cure the disease. The networks can be derived from the dense phenotyping measurements that you make, so the two are beautifully interrelated one to another. Again, in 2014, there was this beautiful convergence of systems biology, systems medicine, scientific wellness, big data, and social networks that articulated much more clearly what P4 medicine is. And I just want to say it is strikingly different from contemporary medicine in almost every way. It's proactive, not reactive. It's all about the individual, and it's all about this striking new concept that in the future, population health is all about N of 1 treatments. Everyone is going to be uniquely treated and uniquely assessed. Number 3, it's about wellness as well as disease. It's about using deep phenotyping to gain insights into wellness, disease, and we think that clinical trials in the future ought to be done as N of 1 experiments. Because what happens with a big clinical trial in cancer? You take 20,000 patients, you give 10,000 the drug, you give 10,000 a placebo, you gather up the data. But the fundamental assumption that is made in all of those trials is that each of the individual units, namely us humans, are identical. And we aren't identical. We're different genetically, we're different environmentally. So what does P4 medicine do? We have 20,000 individuals, each with their unique data clouds, and we can stratify them according to interesting questions. For example, what we've shown is we can ask the question, in a cancer trial, can we use the individual data clouds to actually identify biomarkers that distinguish the responders from the non-responders? And that's really an important question because here's a terrifying statistic. These are the top 10 selling drugs in the US today. The orange person is the responder, the blue is the non-responder. The best drug is 1 in 4, the worst drug is 1 in 25. You spend almost all of your money for drugs that not only don't work, they expose you to the toxicity because every drug has toxicities. So how will we do it with P4 medicine? We'll do 2 really small clinical trials. We'll have a clinical trial first using dense phenotyping, and we'll generate the data clouds, and we'll identify in the 50 patients the biomarkers to distinguish responders from non-responders. Then what we'll do is do a second trial of 50 patients with all responders. And if you get a 98% response rate, the FDA will approve your drug in the blink of an eye. So you go from spending $1.5 billion on a clinical trial to spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a clinical trial. And we're starting to do this actually with Genentech and one kind of test. So I argued that healthcare is these 2 domains, wellness and disease. And I'll also further state that in the next 10 to 15 years, I think the market cap of the wellness industry that's already starting to emerge will far exceed that of the disease industry as we properly reallocate money from disease to wellness where it really should be. So let's talk about this pilot project in scientific wellness we did, Nathan Price and I did in 2014 with 108 of our friends. The one fact I should give you is several studies have been done on the determinants of health. And strikingly, genetics are 30%, environment, lifestyle is 60%, and the healthcare system is 10%. And what's interesting is the dense phenotyping gives you the relative genetic, lifestyle, environment contributions and so forth. So what we did with 108 was determine their complete genome sequences. We did blood draws every 3 months to measure 1,200 analytes of 3 classes, clinical chemistries, proteins, and metabolites. We measured the gut microbiome every 3 months to quantify the microbial species they have, and we used a Fitbit and other devices for digital health measurements. And what these gave us then for each individual were longitudinal data clouds that, when analyzed, led to actionable possibilities that, if executed by the individual, could either improve their wellness and or let them ameliorate or avoid disease. All of the actionable possibilities were curated from the literature, appropriate clinical trials, and the like. And the big question in this is, how do you change social behavior? And what we used were wellness coaches trained in psychology and nutrition or nursing or some other things who are absolutely magnificent. They would elicit from the individual exactly what they wanted in their health objectives. And this is not easy to do, as you might think, but they were terrific at it. And then what you'd do is you'd frame all the actionable possibilities in the context of what the individual himself wanted. And they succeeded with more than 70% compliance on these actionable possibilities. It really was striking. Here's the clinical chemistries for the first round of bloods in the Pioneer 108. As you can see, 91% had nutritional difficulties, 68% inflammation. Mostly it had to do with diet and things like that, not infections. 59% cardiovascular complications, 56% diabetes. 53 of 108 were in fact pre-diabetic. We moved in the 9 months 8 to normal, and most of the rest strikingly over toward normal. So we were able to provide actionable possibilities that were unique in multiplicity for each of the individuals that was available in the study. And this is just a list of some of the actionable possibilities I carried out as a member of the 108 pioneers too. And as background, I'll tell you, I have a really gruesome family history of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's, okay? So those are all things you want to be aware of as you're optimizing your wellness. So I lost weight really easily by looking at my genetics and seeing how optimally I could eat to lose weight without really dieting. I lost more than 20 pounds now, and I almost weigh what I weighed when I played football in college at Caltech. I'll admit it's not. But my home field was the Rose Bowl. I played 16 Rose Bowl games, and I can ask any professional football player how many of you played, and I'm sure to beat him, unless maybe it's UCLA or something like that. Anyway, the second thing is I really changed my exercise regimen. And again, you can look at your genes and you can see how to optimize your energy output and everything. So, and it goes on and on. You can use continuous glucose monitoring to do over a 2-week period a whole series of N-of-1 experiments on dieting, on different foods and what they do to your glucose level and so forth. So I kind of optimize that. Intermittent fasting is a really terrific way to control blood sugar if you're interested in that, and on and on. But the one really interesting experiment was I had blazingly low levels of vitamin D. 1,000 international units didn't touch that at all. And then we found out that there are 3 genes, each with 2 variants that block the uptake of vitamin D. If you have 2 or more of those genes, you need mega doses to get up to normal, and you need large doses to maintain yourself at normal. And that all worked absolutely beautifully. And on and on and on. But I will say 2 things. The one thing you came out of realizing is wellness or health is all about you. That participatory piece is really critical. So you ought to think about what it's going to take to motivate you to change. And we'll give you some nice examples of how you can do it, perhaps more easily than you thought. And one of them is that we can now calculate your biological age, the age your body says you are, as opposed to the age your birthday says you are. And if your biological age is younger than your chronologic age, you're living well. If it's older, you better change your habits. And we'll talk about that in detail. But I'm roughly 15 years younger than my biological age, my chronological age. So I figure I have about 25 years before I have to retire yet. So it's and you students ought to think about that too. You will get to where I am sometime. So anyway, this is the digital devices that can do continuous measurements are really fascinating. And this is pulse rate on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And what you can see, that first little blip turns out to be an airplane flight over the poles. And airlines don't oxygenate you properly. Almost always I get blips when I travel like that. And I will say in some airlines, the blips are bigger than in other airlines. But I've been asked by the airlines not to name any specific. But what was really striking here was I got the worst flu I'd had in about 10 years. And you can see the start of my pulse rate going up. And it went up, 10 beats per second or something. It took a week, and then it turned around and came down to more or less a baseline. But what this is a really sensitive measure of changes in your physiology. And when I went into the Pioneer study, my resting pulse rate was about 55 a minute, and it's now about 41 or 42 a minute. And the lower you get up to a certain degree, the healthier you are. I have bicyclist friends who have pulse rates of 35 that are, really championship types. There are many digital devices we can use to measure things, and they're getting better and better, and they'll be an important part of wellness in the future. Airvale was the program, the company that we started to bring scientific wellness to consumers. And 2 things about Airvale. One, over 4 years it acquired 6,000 clients. These generated longitudinal data clouds that are transformational, as you'll see in a moment. And number 2, we saw in these 6,000 people about 100 transitions from wellness to disease for all chronic diseases. So remember that. We're going to talk about that later as well. I liken these data clouds to the Hubble telescope because it had the resolution to see the heavens and give us fundamental new views into their evolution and structure. And so these data clouds let us look at human biology and disease in ways we never, ever could before. And I'll give you 4 quick examples. We were able to look at the 1,200 analytes and group them into 6 different kinds of categories And for a data bit in each category, we asked, is it statistically associated with data bits in other categories? And these associations revealed interrelationships in many cases we had no idea had ever existed before. We saw here about 3,500 interrelationships, and if you look on the left, it looked like a hairball. It was impossible to decipher anything relevant from. So what we did was created a program that clipped the edges that had the lowest probabilities, and what they revealed very quickly were 70 discrete little communities of analytes that corresponded beautifully either to physiologic phenomena or pathologic phenomena. And to give you an example, this is a cholesterol community that's exploding out, and you can see in that community there are 15 different kinds of molecules, and some of the molecules had a positive correlation with cholesterol. Some of the molecules had a negative correlation, and thyroxine, the negative correlation, it turned out was being developed at the same time as a drug by Lilly as an anti-cholesterol. So the really important point is these 70 communities give us a statistical approach to biomarker and drug target discovery we've never had before, and they're really going to transform our ability to look at certain kinds of relationships. Second, and this is really going to be important for everyone in this room, we've looked at individual polygenic risks for more than 100 different diseases now. And without going into any detail, these are generated by doing genome-wide association studies in very large populations, typically 100,000 or so, where you identify genes, sometimes up to 200 or 300, that play a very small role in the genetic risk itself. And the risk can be either a positive role or a negative role. And because we know the complete genome sequence of each of the individuals in this program, we can take those positive and negative bits and see where they map into your own genome. And from that, we can determine a relative polygenic score that we then match up against more than 2,000 normal individuals that we've put through the same kind of analysis. So you might have a lower, medium, or a high polygenic risk score, but we could do that for everybody in the population. And when we did, we were able to see that there was a distribution from very low to very high scores. And it turned out clinically, these are really important because this is the risk for LDL cholesterol, which is a proxy for cardiovascular disease. If you're at high risk for LDL cholesterol and you have high LDL cholesterol, the only thing that will bring it down are statins and other anti-cholesterol drugs. You can't touch it with lifestyle, exercise, activity. Conversely, if you're at low risk, you can be treated beautifully that way. And my argument is in the future, almost every major disease, we're going to do your polygenic scores and we're going to treat you differently, whether you're at a high risk end or a low risk end. And you want to get into this 21st century medicine as soon as you can. Now, one of the really striking things is we could then go through the analytes and look at how the analytes mapped against increasing genetic risk. And this is, in a sense, what your genetic risk score, how it's reflected in your blood and so forth. So we've done that now with 54 different traits, polygenic scores, and we've found more than 800 analytes that change in relationship to increasing genetic scores. And what's really incredible about this is they provide fundamental insights into what the diseases are all about, and the high-risk ones allow us to reflect many of the same pathologies that you see in people that actually have the disease. So the really interesting idea is, in the future, if you're at high risk but normal, we'll be able to give you a drug so you'll never, ever transition into that disease. This is a whole new way of thinking about preventive medicine that we hope pharma's really going to get excited about, but it's going to take a lot of education for them. Now, this is my favorite of the things that's come out. This is the one about how we can use the expression levels of genes in the various classes of analytes to actually determine your biological age. And I'll just say the key to being able to do this was the fact that we had in Airvale, with 6,000 people, individuals that ranged from 21 to 90 plus. So we could bin them in 10-year categories and look at their analyte expressions and see that the control of expression of analytes decreased strikingly as you got older. And without going into any details, let me just say from that we can calculate for each individual what their biological age is. And some interesting statistics. We had 300 people in Airvale with type 2 diabetes. On average, their biological age was 6 years older than their chronologic age. We had 250 people with cardiovascular disease. On average, they were 3 years older than their biological age. When we looked at those that were in the upper 5% of Fitbit exercise, they were 3 years younger than biologic age. And one of the most spectacular results was a friend of mine who came into Airvale in really good shape, and over the 4 years that he was in Airvale, he lost 10 years in his biological age. So he started at 43 and he ended up at 31. I mean, but the point is, it means we can all get much more healthy than we are now. And I'll tell you, you really feel the difference once you're in that particular category. And what I think is going to be important in the future, and we're thinking of starting a company to do this, is to determine an individual's biological age every year. And if it's lower, you're living well and aging properly. If it's higher, you better do some work. So, and this is a statistic that's really sobering. In 2007, for the first time, 50% of the people were going to live to be 100. The children born then were going to live to be 100. So the real question is, what are your last 15 or 20 years going to be like? If you look at what 20th century medicine does to most people, it's not very pleasant, I have to say. So we want everyone to go all the way through better. And I'm going to return to this at the very end of my lecture, because there's a great book that you ought to read on this that's for the layperson. And the fourth and final transition has to do with wellness to disease transition states. And this woman was diagnosed in 2017 with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, which about as bad a diagnosis as you can get. We did have 4 blood draws, roughly 6 months, each 6 months earlier from before her diagnosis. So what we asked is, for each of those blood draws, we'll look at all 1,200 analytes and we'll ask for each, are they outliers compared to, at that time, the 2,000 people and their analytes that we had. And one of these analytes appeared to be an enormous outlier. It was a protein, it was in a Notch receptor pathway, which is a critical part of pancreatic cancer disease perturbed network. And it was uniquely expressed in the pancreas. So here was a terrific candidate, either as a biomarker or even as a drug target and everything. I will say, we looked at 9 potential disease-related networks for pancreatic cancer, and we looked at each of the 4 blood draws to see if their networks were disease perturbed. And the earliest blood draw had no disease-perturbed networks out of the 9. The second earliest had 1, the third earliest had 2, and the fourth one had 5. So there's exponential increase in disease-expressed networks and so forth. So where does that leave us? In the future, if you participate in scientific wellness, and if you have data prior to the diagnosis of any disease, we'll be able to, 1, use your data as a baseline, and 2, we'll be able to detect the earliest transition point. And in fact, we'll be able to detect it from analytes, from disease-perturbed networks, or several other factors I won't go on and discuss. Now, there's noise in this whole system, so it means we need to look at lots and lots of patients and lots of transitions and do lots and lots of correlations. But I would say in a 5-year period, we'll have the diagnostic earliest markers for virtually all of the major chronic diseases, and we'll be well on the way to using those markers to determine what therapeutic targets we can hit at that earliest transition point. So it's going to be an extreme form of preventive medicine in the 21st century. And this changes us again to this new NF1 approach to disease, where your wellness is specified by your early parameters. We'll see your transitions, and we'll be able to see the increase in networks and all of the other kinds of things, and we'll look for the therapies that can reverse the earliest kind of transitions. So we really think then, with the 100 transitions we've looked at already, that we'll be able both to get biomarkers and therapeutic targets for that earliest transition, and then use that, as I said, the preventive medicine of the 21st century. If we can do this for most chronic diseases, the striking statistic is 86% of our healthcare dollars are spent on chronic diseases. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just save that money and spend it all on wellness or something worthwhile? So we'll talk a little bit then about how we're actually going to take this approach with a major disease called Alzheimer's. But one other thing about this model is 20th century medicine only works on after you've diagnosed the disease. So there at the far end of this spectrum, 21st century medicine works on wellness and the transitions. So that is the most fundamental difference. And I'll tell you, with most chronic diseases, if you wait until you've manifested yourself as a bad phenotype, you'll never reverse it. And in many cases, you'll not even be able to ameliorate it. And cancer is really a great example of that. So Alzheimer's is absolutely a horrible kind of disease. And let me just say, I'll give you one statistic on Alzheimer's. In the last 12 years, there have been 600 clinical trials, each $1 billion or more, okay? 0 have worked. How could people have been so wrong? And it's the herd mentality of thinking amyloid and tau and some of these things are important. They're not causes, they're consequences. And they have the whole thing turned around. So what we decided to do is use 3 really major paradigm changes to attack it. So 1, we're going to use dense phenotyping to be able to get the early transitional diagnostics. Number 2, I had a friend of mine, Dale Bredesen, who wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's. And what he did about 12 years ago was say, let's take a systems approach to optimizing synaptic communication, which is one of the things we lose in Alzheimer's. And he came up with a 36-point regimen that was really complicated, that included drugs, included supplements, it included vitamins, it included exercise, diet, sleep, and a whole variety of things. And it was adaptive. You looked at the patient and you gave them what they didn't have. And he took 100 individuals, it wasn't a clinical trial, it was an observational trial. He showed within a year he had 80% of them back to normal again. So what we've decided to do initially in conjunction with him, and now for different reasons we've split off our own ways, is to take that approach and then couple it with a third approach. And it's a big point that I haven't made yet. Wellness is about your body, but it's also about your brain. And your brain has to be well as your body. And to keep your brain well, you have to exercise it the way you exercise your heart and your body. And how do you go about exercising it? Well, a friend of mine named Michael Merzenik at UCSF has pioneered cognitive health approaches, which over the last 30 years have demonstrated that there are 25 cognitive features that you can measure in a human being, and that in a normal human development, those maximize at about the mid-30s, and for most of us, no matter what our professions are, they fade away. And what he did a great clinical trial on is he took a series of 80-year-olds and showed he could bring them back to what they should have been in their mid-30s. So his argument is the brain is incredibly plastic, and unless you lose neurons, then that's a different kind of thing. So we'll be using cognitive health. So with Alzheimer's, the horrifying fact is you can use metabolic PET scanning to actually detect Alzheimer's 4 to 10 years before the clinical diagnosis can be made. So by the time everybody gets their diagnosis, they've really had a long time. So what we're going to do with the data clouds in conjunction with metabolic PET scanning is to get blood biomarkers that will mark that earliest transition point. And we'll use those patients to focus then on this, as we call it, multimodal therapy that came out of Dale Bredesen, and try and reverse them. The earlier you are in the Alzheimer's cycle, the easier it is to reverse the individual. And we're setting up now a series of clinical trials that use both the multimodal approach and this cognitive health approach of Merzenich. And we set one up at the Hoag Institute in Los Angeles, and its results are early, but they really look spectacular. And we're setting a clinic up very close to ISB, and it's a private clinic, and we're going to be doing N-of-1 experiments with them in ways I'll show you in a moment. And then we've set up a third series of trials down at St. John's to carry out these trials. So we're very optimistic about what's going to happen. So let me tell you that one of the most important things for medicine in the 21st century is to use AI effectively in the context of expert systems, because all of biology is getting way too complex for ordinary doctors to be able to deal. So we and a colleague have done the following for Alzheimer's. We read Dale Bredesen's book, and you can reduce it to 842 concepts that can be placed in a deep knowledge platform, each as an intelligent Lego that has the ability to communicate with the 840 some other Legos. But most important, the Legos then can communicate with each individual's patient data as it comes in. And from that interaction can feed out, one, a diagnostic protocol that is in a sufficient form to be put directly in the EPIC database, and two, a therapeutic protocol for this very complicated kind of disease. And I'll just say, without going into any detail, that Providence has domain experts that will let us validate each of these N-of-1 experiments. And by the time we've done 200 of them, we figure we'll be as good as any expert. And more than that, we can use this system in the context of a physician in Walla Walla, Washington, and make him equivalent to the domain expert with this thing. And we'll feed the N of 1 data into ISB, and we'll come to learn more about Alzheimer's and add that in as additional intelligent dominoes. So it's a continuous learning system, which is going to be true of all 21st century medicine. So Providence St. Joseph's is a big system. As I said, it's got 51 hospitals. It sees 8 million patients a year. It's got 30 million electronic medical records, more than big enough to make an enormous difference. We are setting up a whole series of clinical trials using 1, deep phenotyping, and 2, systems approaches to look at what therapies might come from these trials beyond what you're testing. And scientific wellness is a trial that's gone on for 2 years now. Again, its preliminary results are really terrific. The Alzheimer's, and we've just started with Genentech, a multiple sclerosis trial. And the rest of these trials will be done, started within this next year or so. But what I do want to end up with is a bold new program that we're just trying to launch now, where we're going to take 1 million Providence patients over the next 5 years, and we're going to do deep phenotyping on them, plus genome analysis. And what we're going to do is look at DNA sequence, at the phenotypes, and those are the same kind of things we talked about with the 108 pioneers. But we're also going to integrate in each of their medical records into a cloud, and we're going to use the AI system then to deliver the analyzed and integrated data sets to physicians for their patients in terms of diagnosis and therapy for the individual people. To do this, we need partnerships, and I've spent a lot of the last year setting up these partnerships with the companies that will make the measurements, as well as technology companies like Google and Microsoft and 3 or 4 pharmas. And we're in the midst of negotiation for doing that right now. We're going to start at the end of the first quarter next year with the first 5,000 patients. And what we're going to do is 1,000 well patients, family practitioners. We're going to do 1,000 cardiovascular, 1,000 diabetes, 1,000 cancer, and 1,000 GI. And I'll say at the end of the 5-year period, with 200,000 for each of those, we'll know more data about these diseases than we've accumulated in all history before. So it's really going to be a very exciting kind of time. And here's a list of all of the actionable possibilities that are going to arise. And we haven't time to go into it, but I'll just say at the end of a 5-year period, I expect to discover 5,000 to 10,000 new actionable possibilities, each of which has the ability to improve wellness and or let you avoid and or ameliorate disease and so forth. So the final thing I want to talk about is this book, which you really ought to read, which is called The 100-Year Life. And it's really interesting because for the last 200 years, our lifespan has increased 2 years every 10 years in a beautiful linear way, and it isn't changing in any appreciable manner in the near future. And as I said, in 2007, for the first time, half the children born could expect to live to be 100. And in fact, if you're 20 today, you have a 50% chance of living to be 100. And if you're 60, you have a 50% chance of living into your 90s or so. So the really interesting question is, if we're going to have all of this extra time, 10 to 20 years or so, what exactly are we going to do with it? And of course, it brings with it a lot of challenges. How are you going to have enough money to live 30 years after you supposedly have retired? Well, the answer is you're not. And you're going to have to go through a series of job transitions as you evolve, because most people's jobs will evolve out of existence, as is happening every day. So how do we teach people to be creative, to figure out how to change jobs? It's the healthiest thing in the world to be able to do. And the intangible assets, which I'll go into in just a moment, are really key, because if you're going to live 20 or 30 extra years, are you going to live it bored? Are you going to, and you can't play golf and tennis for 20 to 30, I mean, only play golf and tennis. Look, it's exercise, it's good, I'm not arguing against it. We're going to have to educate our young as to what's coming, because they ought to be thinking in very different ways than most people do now. And the most important thing, and this isn't discussed in the book at all, is health, because you need your body and your mind sound if you're going to really take advantage of all of that. So what are the tangible assets? Well, they're jobs and money and stocks and home and all of those kind of things. The intangible assets, education, family, and friends, and enthusiasm for life, and changing disciplines, and all of these kind of things. And I mean, that's what makes life really, really worth living. So how are we going to give the passion for the intangible assets to people? And interacting with people is the first key asset as you get older. It's really critical. So what about health? Scientific wellness is going to give you these actionable possibilities that'll hopefully let you go into your 90s mentally alert, physically capable. Your genetic risk scores, maybe we're going to be able to use those in the immediate treatment of diseases. But in the longer run, maybe we can take all the high-risk people for all the diseases and fix them before they ever get the diseases. There are ways to think about that. We'll be able to deal with identify the disease transitions and reverse them. And there are all the actionable possibilities that'll come from the Genome and Phenome Project. So, and what's really going to be key is to practice brain health in a variety of different kinds of ways. So in closing, let me say, I think what 21st century will give you, whatever you do, hopefully, is one, the ability to age really well and to be well. Number two, the ability to see early transitions to disease and reverse them. Number three, this is going to staggeringly reduce the cost of health care. We haven't talked about it, but I'll just tell you, Alzheimer's costs us $500 billion a year today. Suppose in 5 years we've reduced it to 10% of what we have now. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of saving, as one example. And the final point, which is really important for healthcare systems, is as we migrate to wellness, we're going to migrate from big hospitals with complicated buildings to the home. And we're going to have a tricorder in 10 or 15 years that can prick your thumb and make 5,000 measurements on a droplet of blood and send that information to an analytic center, and that they'll send it to your coach and to your physician, and you'll get everything done at home easily, checking it once a month, once every 2 months, whatever it is. But the really important point is you're going to have the chance, all of you, to live a lot longer. Take advantage of it. Thank you.
All right, quickly, do we have any questions for Dr. Hood? Dr. Barron.
Well, thank you for that absolutely elegant lecture, but I wonder if you could mention about the role of mental health and how it modulates the biology. So we know that life expectancy is actually going down because of suicide and drug abuse. So I think, how do we integrate this beautiful data and inspiring in the realm of how people, not just brain activity, but kind of their mind, how they feel, and how anxiety and depression and other mood states modulate this in a negative way?
I think that's a superb point. I agree with with your concerns and everything. And I think we can approach it in two ways. One, I think what we've done for the body with the wellness coaches could very well be done for the mind for a lot of states that you've got there. And I'd love to see exploring new approaches there. I would say number two, it is really clear to me that most mental diseases have serious genetic components. Once we identify them, we can think about how to deal with them in various ways. So there, and I can tell you a story. We did, well, we don't have time to go into that. We did a study on bipolar disease, and we identified 125 variants that correlated with bipolar disease in about 50 families with multiple affecteds and 40 control families. All 125 of those variants fell into one of two categories. They were either calcium ion transporter pathway or beta-adrenergic pathway. So I think whether it's the psychological, physicians just don't have the time to deliver what people need for body wellness, let alone psychological wellness. But we can do genetics too, and phenomics too. Yeah.
So how is Providence Healthcare implementing this P4 approach in a pilot program, or so how do?
Well, I'm in the process of proselytizing them that they should do this, but they've moved in major steps. Providence has paid for the Alzheimer's clinical trials, and those are coming very well. Providence paid for the wellness clinical trial. And Genentech, fortunately, is paying for the multiple sclerosis trial. But all of those other trials I pointed out that are going to be approached the same way are being paid for. A lot of it's being paid for by philanthropy, as a matter of fact. So that's one thing. But the other thing is Providence has basically agreed to pay for the pilot project that is the first 5,000 in the first year of this 1 million person project. So they're making major commitments. Now, the problem with all big healthcare systems like Providence, and even the most efficient ones, is bureaucracy, and especially its mid-level bureaucrats who think they own everything and know everything, and they are really difficult to deal with. But
Lee, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I wonder if you've thought at all about how you hinted at the idea that artificial intelligence will drive a lot of the diagnosis and therapeutic planning. Have you thought about how this will affect the type of education we need for health professionals in the future, or even the type of person who will go into the health fields? I'm inclined to think if machines do a lot of the thinking, then healthcare professionals will be more like concierge, people who guide people through, but don't necessarily need all the content expertise. But have you thought of anything?
I have thought about that. And my view is what education of physicians and other health professionals should do is educate you down to quite a detailed level. And what the AI will do is the infinite detail. But you'll have the conceptual classifications of things, so you know where to go and where to look for and things like that. And I think that's vital, because otherwise physicians are technicians. Yeah, and I think in putting together these higher level things, they still can be creative. But the infinite detail, the classic example is the 10 or 20,000 actionable possibilities that have come out of this genome. There's no human geneticist that could even begin to deal with that complexity. And let me give you a really interesting example. There are 7,500 diseases that are called Mendelian recessives. That means you need 2 bad copies to get the disease. Turns out that's absolutely wrong. We've shown beautifully with hemochromatosis in Airville, we have 9 individuals that are homozygous for the gene and all should have the disease right in their late ages. Only 3 of the individuals have it. So it means there are genes that modify whether you can get the disease. On the other hand, we have 45 heterozygotes, okay? 9 of them have classic high iron levels. That means there are other genes that can facilitate hemizygous conditions, that is, a single copy of the gene. There are 7,500 of those Mendelian recessives. You have to be able to keep track of all of those for all people so you know which things you're going to have to be looking for in that individual to see if, even though a heterozygote, they might come up with whatever it is. So that's a beautiful example. But the geneticist will understand the disease at the higher level, just not at the lower level. Yeah.
We have time for one more, right there.
So the biological clock as the aging to predict, how does that compare to the age predicted by the genetic clock?
That is really a terrific question, and the answer is we don't know, but we're doing some comparative studies. But I say our clock is really different because our clock is the aggregate of 1,200 analyte measurements that assay hundreds of different biological systems in every part of the body. So it's much more a global averaging than epigenetics, which is the modification of DNA or histones and things like that. So I think that has a much limited focus. But the answer is we don't know. And certainly Stephen Horvath and epigenetics have been started long before we ever started thinking about these things. So, but comparing them is really going to be fascinating. And as you know, there are companies out there that are doing aging based on epigenetics and things like that.
Sadly, our time grows short, and we have a little bit of business before we wrap up. Dr. Wilson, would you like to come up and participate in the unveiling? Dr. Hood, you'll head this way. Every year at the Pumerantz lecture, our guest speaker that year is added to our enduring plaque. So this year, without too much fanfare.
I feel like Vanna White.
Can I help?
Please do.
There we go. Terrific.
We also have some gifts for Dr. Hood as a token of appreciation for his visit to Western U. I want to thank you very much for your presentation here tonight. Let's hear it once again for Dr. Lee Hood. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. It was 2-0 Dodgers in the 8th. And good luck and good night.
How about the Rams and the Seahawks?
The Rams were up 28-26 with about 8 minutes left.
Oh, wow. I thought it would. Yeah.
Congratulations, thank you.
Thank you.
Pose shot with the
Sure, sure. Okay, good.
This is great. I'm actually on the 15th heading to a meeting of evolutionary